Overseer Thrast-Corvin was mid-sentence when the human stopped working. He had been explaining, in terms he considered generous, that the ventilation complaint filed by Station Human 3 Vela Osei, 22 years old, assigned to the secondary calibration line of Keth-Varun Fabrication Hall since the exchange program began, was not a matter that warranted floor interruption. The complaint had been filed twice, then a third time. Each time, the station environmental office had returned a form confirming that atmospheric conditions in Hall B met the compact minimum standard for human-compatible habitats. The form cited a regulation. The regulation cited a prior regulation. Thrast-Corvin had attached both to his response, which he considered thorough. Vela Osei had read the forms. Then she had set down her calibration tool, placed both hands flat on her workstation, and gone completely still. The machines around her kept cycling. The line kept moving. For approximately 4 seconds, nothing else happened. Then the first cascade alarm sounded. Thrast-Corvin did not immediately connect the two events. He was a Veth, tall, narrow-shouldered, built for the long corridors of administrative blocks rather than fabrication floors, and he had managed Hall B for 6 years without learning to read the line the way the floor technicians did. He managed outputs. He managed schedules. He managed the 41 workers on the day shift and the forms they generated, which were considerable. He looked up at the alarm panel. Section 7, see secondary calibration. He looked down at the floor. Vela Osei had not moved. Station Human 3, Thrast-Corvin said, crossing the elevated walkway to the railing above her station. Your line indicator is active. She looked up at him. She did not pick up her tool. The ventilation in this section, she said, is at 61% of stated capacity. I know because I measured it. I know because the 2 workers stationed beside me filed the same report 8 days ago, and they have both been reassigned since then. I am not filing another form. Thrast-Corvin drew himself to his full height, which on a Veth was considerable. His neck crest, pale gray and ridged, rose slightly, the involuntary signal his species produced when addressing a subordinate who had misread a situation. The environmental readings show compliance with the compact minimum, she said. I know. I read the regulation. The compact minimum was written for Veth respiratory function. Humans require approximately 12% more oxygen turnover at sustained manual labor. I included the citation in my third filing. You did not respond to that part. The second cascade alarm joined the first. Further down the line, something upstream of her station had begun backing up. A floor technician named Dasrell, one of 3 Veth floor workers on the day shift, was moving toward the problem with the careful haste of someone who understood what a calibration stall meant for downstream output. Thrast-Corvin was aware of the alarms. He was more aware of the fact that a human exchange worker was standing motionless in the middle of the shift window, hands flat on her workstation, looking at him with an expression he could not categorize. It was not anger. It was not distress. It was something quieter and considerably more difficult to address with a form. You are required, he said carefully, to maintain your station during active production hours. I am, Vela said, maintaining my station. My hands are on it. I am right here. The third alarm. Dasrell reached the upstream accumulation point and stopped. He looked at the jam, looked at Vela's station, and then looked up at Thrast-Corvin with an expression the Overseer recognized. The expression of someone who understood the problem and was waiting to see if the person in charge did too. Thrast-Corvin did not yet fully understand the problem. What he understood was that 3 alarms were active, that downstream output had ceased, and that the human at the secondary calibration station was the geometric center of all 3. He had assumed this was coincidence. He was beginning to revise that assumption. Explain, he said, not to Vela, to Dasrell. Dasrell's crest stayed flat neutral, careful. Station Human 3 runs the secondary calibration intercept. She cross-checks the tolerance variance from the primary line and manually adjusts for the material density shift that the automated system cannot resolve at current throughput speeds. He paused. She has been doing it since her third day. Before that, we ran a 12% defect rate on this section. Since then, we run 2. Thrast-Corvin looked at his output sheets. They had shown a consistent improvement over the past 6 weeks. He had attributed this to a recent firmware update on the primary conveyor. There was no firmware update, Dasrell said, not unkindly. He had apparently seen the Overseer's expression and made an accurate inference. That was her. The downstream section had now gone fully idle. 61 units sat in queue. The shift window was 40 minutes old. At current trajectory, the daily output target would be missed for the first time in 6 weeks, precisely the duration of Vela Osei's assignment to secondary calibration. Thrast-Corvin descended from the walkway. He was not a fast thinker in the sense of being reckless. He was, in fact, quite deliberate, which was why he had risen to floor Overseer without making many visible errors. He also knew, as he stepped down onto the fabrication floor and crossed toward the secondary calibration station, that he was in the process of making one right now, or rather, that he had been making it for 3 filings in 6 weeks, and was only now arriving at its full dimensions. He stopped 2 meters from Vela Osei's workstation. She had not moved. Her hands were still flat on the surface. She was not performing anything. She was simply standing there looking at him, waiting. Behind her, the Q counter on the station screen was incrementing steadily. It would keep incrementing until the upstream buffer hit maximum, and then the primary line would fault. He had, by his estimate, 10 minutes before that happened. "You measured the ventilation yourself," he said. "Yes." "With what instrument?" "The atmospheric sensor from my kit. I calibrated it against the Hall as standard, which runs at full spec, before I used it in here. The readings are in my 3rd filing." He had not read the 3rd filing past the first 2 pages, which had contained the same regulation citation as the previous 2. He saw now that this had been an error. "If I commit to a maintenance review of the Section 7C ventilation system," he said, "within this shift cycle." "Today," Vela said. "Today," he repeated, "would you return to operation?" She looked at him for a moment. The noise of the idle line was not loud, but it was present, the particular quiet of machinery that should be running and was not. "The 2 workers who filed before me," she said, "Salarek and Dean Var, they were reassigned to storage handling. I would like to know if that was connected to the filings." Thrast-Corvin's crest moved. He did not entirely control it. "That is an HR matter." "I know it is. I am asking anyway." He considered the 41 workers in Hall B who were, at this moment, watching the conversation from their stations with the studied focus of people who were absolutely not watching the conversation. He considered the 61 units in queue. He considered the 3rd filing he had not fully read, which apparently contained instrumental data and a citation he could not now dismiss. He also considered that Dasrell was still standing at the upstream jam and had made no move to clear it on his own, which meant, he suspected, that Dasrell had already made a private calculation about whose side of this conversation he was on. "I will review those reassignments," he said, "personally." Vela Osei picked up her calibration tool. She did not say anything further. She turned back to her workstation, checked the queue status on the station screen, made 2 adjustments that meant nothing to Thrast-Corvin but apparently meant something to the upstream jam, because Dasrell, 20 meters away, visibly relaxed. He began clearing the accumulation point without being asked. A second-floor worker who had drifted close during the standoff moved back to her station without comment, as if she had simply been passing through. The alarms cleared in sequence. The line resumed. Thrast-Corvin stood on the fabrication floor for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Around him, 41 workers returned to the particular focused motion of people who had seen exactly what they had expected to see, and were now deciding how much they wanted to remember later. He returned to his walkway. He pulled up the third filing. He read it in full this time: the atmospheric measurements, the calibration notes, the citation appendix, and the final section, which he had not seen before, where Vela Osei had noted, in plain and specific language, the cascade effect that a sustained oxygen deficit would have on human manual precision over a 6-hour shift. The numbers were clear. The methodology was documented. The conclusion was that the Hall B ventilation issue was not a comfort complaint. It was a production risk. She had labeled it that way in the heading of the filing, which he had also not read. He filed a maintenance priority request for Section 7C ventilation. He marked it urgent. He sent it before the end of the shift. Then he opened the reassignment records for Sol Eric and Dean Var. It took him the better part of an hour. What he found did not reflect well on a processing decision made 6 weeks ago, before Vela Osei had arrived on the exchange placement. He had not made the decision himself, but he had signed the routing form without checking the underlying data, which amounted to the same thing at the review level. Both workers had filed ventilation complaints. Both reassignment notices had been processed within 48 hours of those filings. The documentation cited productivity reclassification. The actual productivity records, when he pulled them, had been within normal range for the section. He flagged the discrepancy, attached the productivity data, and forwarded the complete file to the Oversight Division with his own name in the originator field. That, too, he decided, was appropriate. At the end of the shift, Thrast-Corvin descended to the floor again. Vela Osei was logging her output. The station screen showed her tallied count for the day, adjusted for the 40-minute idle window. She had still cleared 93% of daily target, which was, he now understood, almost entirely the product of a 2% defect rate that had no business being as low as it was on a line running at below specification atmospheric support. "The maintenance team will be here in the morning," he said. "Full ventilation assessment, Section 7C through 7F. She nodded, writing something. "The reassignments," he said, "were incorrectly processed. I am initiating a review." She looked up then. "I cannot promise an outcome," he said, "but I can promise it will be reviewed properly and not rooted to a form that goes nowhere." Vela Osei considered this. The floor around them was clearing, the day shift finishing out, workers heading toward the exit corridors. A few of them glanced over. Dasrell, passing behind Thrast-Corvin on his way out, made no particular expression, which on a Veth was its own kind of expression. "All right," she said. That was all. She went back to her log. Thrast-Corvin stood there for a moment, because he had expected something more and was not sure whether to be relieved or unsettled that there was not. She had asked for maintenance and a review. She had received a commitment to both. As far as she was concerned, the matter had moved to the next stage, and standing around waiting for acknowledgement was apparently not something she had budgeted time for. He walked back to his office. The floor went quiet behind him, the way floors go quiet when something has just shifted, and everyone present knows it, and no one is going to say so out loud. He spent the rest of the evening cross-referencing 6 weeks of output data against the atmospheric readings from her filing. The correlation was precise and consistent, and he was honest enough to admit this, at least internally obvious in retrospect. A production improvement that had appeared from nowhere, attributed to a firmware update that had never happened, running through the hands of one exchange worker who had filed 3 ventilation complaints and been, each time, redirected to a form. He sent a second message that night, not to the maintenance team, to the exchange program coordinator. It contained his quality output data, the atmospheric correlation, and a single attached note recommending that Vela Osei's assignment to secondary calibration be extended for the remainder of the exchange term. He added one sentence in the notes field that he had not planned to write and did not revise once he had. "She knows this floor better than I do." The coordinator replied the next morning. The extension was approved. Vela Osei arrived for her shift, read the notification on her station screen, and went to work without comment. The ventilation team was already in Section 7C when she arrived, running assessment lines along the duct housings with deliberate efficiency. The ceiling above her workstation smelled cleaner within the hour. She picked up her calibration tool. The line ran at full specification for the first time since she had been assigned to it, and the defect rate, which had held at 2% for 6 weeks, dropped to 1.4 by end of shift. Thrast-Corvin noted it in his output report. He did not attribute it to a firmware update.